Professor Greg Whyte is a former Olympian and sports scientist responsible for putting together celebrity challenges for sport relief and children in need. To date, he's helped raise over £38 million for charity. In today's pod, we look back at the first week of the Olympics with him and break down the performances that have really stood out.
At the moment, it is the performance of the Olympics for me.
You know, the idea of 5 medals at 5 games is astonishing, isn't it?
If you've never been on a 10-metre platform, just jumping off, you've probably missed out the most important piece. And that was, less than a month ago, he was cycling at the Tour de France.
Yes.
I think it would be very difficult to argue that she isn't the greatest Olympian of all time.
With the Olympics, Greg, it's really tricky after week one and so many medals where to actually start. I feel like the way to compartmentalise this conversation is let's take it in gold and silvers. Because we've got so many key players to talk about. I feel like we're going to have to compartmentalise them somehow. So let's start with the gold-winning performances. Can we start with what's been going on in the pool, which is just such a sight to behold with those men 4x200 freestyle as well. That was absolutely fantastic. They were there defending their title, which has never been done before. Can you just put into context what it takes to come back and do that again 4 years later?
Well, I think for me, at the moment, it is the performance of the Olympics for me, the 4x2. Absolutely astonishing that you can defend that title. And I look back, 20 years ago when an Olympic gold medal in the swimming pool was as rare as rocking horse teeth. You can name those athletes who, like David Wilkie and, etc., who won an Olympic gold medal. So a gold medal to win in the pool is really some going against some of the huge nations, the US, Australia. There's so much competition, number one. Number two is they defended that title. And you sort of think, well, defending the title is incredible. The repetition of success.
Why is it so hard?
Why is it so
hard to do that? Because a lot was made of that, rightly so. But just put it into sort of a performance context, why that's so hard to do that.
Well, I think, look, it's hard to do as an individual, but as a team, you need 4 of the greatest 200-metre freestyle swimmers on the planet in your team at that moment in time. Now, to do that once is utterly incredible, but to actually maintain that and to actually deliver 4 of the greatest 200-metre freestyle swimmers again, and to repeat that's what's truly remarkable for me. Is actually we sort of look at the individual events as if they're the most important, but actually the team events, it's everything coming together. It's the perfect storm of having the group of individuals. And I think for me, it's the fact that it's swimming, the fact that you are against some of the greatest swimming nations in the world, obviously at the Olympics, but it's the fact that it's a relay. It's the fact that that's been repeated Olympic on Olympic. Without any shadow of doubt, for me, at the moment, the outstanding performance of the Olympics at Team GB.
And what about that Duncan Scott? Because he's now got 7 Olympic medals, which is quite a haul. I mean, when you compare that against other greats, that's an amazing haul. I mean, is he getting as much attention as he should be?
Well, he shouldn't, because if you have a look at who he's with on that, both of whom have been knighted. And here's a guy that if you walk down the street, in the UK and you ask them to name a swimmer, most people, unless you are interested in swimming, most people would struggle to name Duncan Scott. And here he is, 7 Olympic medals. I mean, it's truly incredible when you think about it. And again, the thing with swimming is that to do that over time, I think, for me, one of the greatest feats really is actually the repetition of medal winning. If you think about who are the greatest of all times for Team GB, well actually Ben is a great example of that. Ben Ainslie, because of the repetition of it over time. Steve Redgrove, 5 Olympic gold medals, but importantly over 5 Olympic games. That is sustaining being the best in the world for 20 years. I mean, truly remarkable. And so when you look at someone like Duncan Scott, 7 medals an incredible feat, particularly again because it's in the pool, and particularly again because the change in fortune of British swimming, it has transformed from the 80s and 90s to what we see today in terms of the success that we see in the pool. 7 medals, he definitely, is on par with the greatest Olympians of all time for Great Britain, and he definitely deserves more recognition.
What do you put down to, like you say, there has been this absolutely massive rise in the pool in terms of GB performances in the past sort of decade or so. What do you put that down to? What are we doing now that we weren't doing before?
It's an interesting one. But I remember back in 2004, I was working for the British Olympic Association. I was the director of research at the British Olympic Medical Centre. And the 2004 Olympics in Athens, I managed the athlete lodge, which is effectively where all the athletes go to meet their families, etc., just outside the Olympic Village. And at the time, we were looking after all of the swimming coaches. And so I spent quite a lot of the games chatting with them and trying to understand what was going on. And I think one of the key changes, now, again, this is up for debate, who believes it, but there was a performance director called Bill Sweetenham, who I think to some extent was a bit Marmite. I think there were a lot of people who really didn't like what he did or how he did it, but plenty would recognise his importance. And I think what he did fundamentally was change culture. He changed the culture of the sport, and so the understanding of what hard work was and how to deliver and when to deliver at the right time. And so I would dare to say that what effectively happened was it wasn't actually about talent. It wasn't about the swimmers themselves. It wasn't about the coaching talent. I think it was just about the overarching culture of the sport and the belief that you could deliver success in the pool.
I want to switch your attention now to out of the pool and onto the cross-country cycling with the cross-country bike with Tom Pidcock. What an amazing performance that was, that saw him come back from a puncture. I think he was down to 9th at one point, and then he managed to overtake via a tree that was in the middle of the course, go one way where the other guy went the other way, and subsequently ended up with gold. I mean, what sort of a thing does it take to pull off a performance like that, and to have the kind of just the sort of confidence in oneself to come back from being, having a puncture way back and also down in 9th?
Well, do you know what? You've probably missed out the most important piece, and that was less than a month ago. He was cycling at the Tour de France.
Yes.
The toughest, one would dare to say, the toughest endurance race on the planet.
Exactly.
Not only was he racing there, he then picked up COVID and had to withdraw from the Tour de France. He's now had to overcome COVID, recover from that, and then come to the Olympic Games. And cross-country mountain biking is no means feat. I mean, it is a tough race. 32 kilometres? It's a long race. And one of the things that we have seen in Paris is the sort of perturbations in the weather. But on that particular day, incredibly hot. So what's really interesting about it is all of those challenges that are put in his way. You then add on top of it, I mean, the puncture was something to behold, wasn't it? I mean, I would say that the entire viewing population that was watching that race was more nervous than what Tom and his mechanic. Tom and his mechanic was just like an everyday event. Oh, yeah, okay, we'll change the wheel and it'll go back on and we'll get going again. And everybody else is watching going, get the wheel on! So I think, it was, I mean, truly incredible. Interestingly, if you watch Tom before and you watch Tom race, what you do see is that is stereotypical of how he races. He sits at the back to begin with. I mean, he's run races from the 8th line of the grid, from a long way back. Really quite unusual to do. But what he does is he sits back and then he works his way through the field, and he always comes late. But believe you, it was a nervous way, wasn't it, when you were watching? Because he came really late.
Is that a sort of as an athlete, like you say, there'll be some that want to lead from the front, from the get-go, and then there are others who like this sort of challenge of coming through the field. I mean, at what point in an athlete's career do they decide which path works for them? And because it must be a conscious decision to decide to sort of employ those tactics repeatedly.
Yeah, I think definitely. And on top of that is the sort of psychology of it. It's what works for you. Some people like, and also, interesting enough, it depends on the event. So if you take a look at rowing, for example, actually, there's very little value of being behind. Now, there's some great races that Team GB have had actually coming from behind and coming through to win a medal. But generally, being in front, because you are facing backwards, it's the best point at which you can see the opposition, and what you can then do is respond to what they are doing. So if they increase their stroke rate, if their speed starts to increase, you can respond to that because you can see them. If you are behind them, as it were, and therefore you can't see them, you don't know what's going on. So it's event dependent, number one. Number two is actually it evolves over time. Tom has been nurturing that approach over a number of years to get to the point where that's the one that works for him the best. Of course, psychologically, there's nothing better than overtaking people. Being overtaken can be incredibly demoralizing, where actually overtaking people is incredibly, it's empowering. And at the same time, every athlete that you pass, you know that they're going to be a bit disappointed because you've passed them, and at the same time you're empowered because you're overtaking them. So it's a double whammy within that. But also, I think what underpins that though is his physiology. Is that actually you've got to have the physiology who can cope with that. After over an hour of racing, that's when you start to put the hammer down. That's when you start to move through the race.
So what will he have when you say his physiology? What has he got that others perhaps don't, that gives him that extra bit of class?
I mean, everything is the answer. I mean, interesting. He's incredibly light. I don't know if those people who watch the Tour de France will know that when he was commenting on one of the particular stages, top of my head, I think he was saying that he started that particular day at about 56 kilos. 56 kilos, super light, number one. But he's got a huge amount of power. So we talk an awful lot in cycling about power to weight ratio. But power to weight ratio, if you take a look at that cross-country course, makes a really big difference, because there were some big climbs on the cross-country mountain bike. That power to weight ratio really helps him. Number one, it gets him up the hill quicker than everybody else. But I guess more importantly is he's more economical in doing that. In other words, he's saving energy. Yeah. And so therefore he can actually save energy for later in the race, number one. Number two is actually his endurability. Because, here's a guy who races mountain bike, but also races the Tour de France, the toughest endurance race on the planet. So, what we know is that things like, these sort of words that we talk about, things like VO2 max, his VO2 max will be exceptional. His anaerobic threshold will be exceptional. His power to weight ratio. And then actually, one of the things that really intrigued me was that final overtake. The power production and the instantaneous power production was just incredible. It came past the French rider, not to the disappointment of the crowd, because you heard their response. But the ability to produce that much power that late on in the race tells you that he's incredibly powerful as well, all being in the low 50 kilogram body weight. I mean, it's a truly astonishing achievement.
Yeah, it's amazing. You mentioned about how special it is for an athlete to overtake. What about Alex Yi's performance in the triathlon? I mean, the last however many meters of that, where he did just that and left what he obviously needed in the tank. And the commentary was interesting, because I think it even caught them by surprise that he had that much left in the tank, and he knew exactly what he was doing, right? Caught everybody out. What did you make of his triathlon performance? Because, of course, it reaped the benefits and he won gold.
Yeah. I mean, I just thought it was imperious, really. I just thought, what he did incredibly well. And it's an interesting one when you watch sport, is that what we do is we focus on the individual. So we focus on what Alex Yi's doing. But effectively, it's the New Zealander who, to some extent, easy to be critical when you sat here, talking on camera. But what the assumption would be that he just went out too hard too early in that run. What Alex didn't do is he didn't respond to that. He didn't
Yes,
change his
exactly.
plan.
He ran his own race.
Clearly had a plan.
Yeah.
He absolutely ran his own race. He ran the pace that he wanted to run. And it was interesting. The commentary was interesting because there was a real concern about the fact that actually the gap was widening.
Yes, exactly.
And a real concern that he would never close that gap down, never close that gap down. But his confidence in his own ability and his race plan was such that he knew that he would pull that back. And of course, he did exactly the right thing when he did overtake, and that is he overtook like a steam train, didn't he? I mean, it made, again,
it does show, like you say, it's like
how demoralizing it is.
Yeah, and super maturity, really mature run from him, and really mature performance from him, because he probably doesn't care what anyone watching is thinking, but absolutely that sort of confidence in himself and just sticking to the game plan to know he had what he needed when he needed it. It was remarkable, wasn't it? I mean, it's interesting because triathlons have become something that are very popular now with all sorts of people. Everyday people are doing triathlons every weekend now up and down the country. I suppose it's garnering much more attention than it did even in the days when the Brownlee brothers were taking it by storm.
Yeah. I mean, what you have to remember here is that, Great Britain, in Olympic terms, is the most successful nation in triathlon ever.
Wow.
And on top of that, it's only been an Olympic sport since 2000. I remember the first Olympics when it ran. It's a relatively new sport to the Olympics. And yet we have been the most successful across that. You name but a few, but equally and importantly, both men's and women's. We're incredibly strong across the piece. Beth's bronze. We talk an awful lot about the gold and silver, but actually that bronze was something else. I mean, fantastic. And here's a girl in Beth Potter who kicked off her career as a 10,000 meter track runner.
Yeah,
and has moved into triathlon with great success. And I think what's interesting for her is that when she first came into triathlon, obviously off the back of 10K, she was dominant in the run, but didn't really have what it took in the swim bike. And what she has done is she has evolved into a triathlete. And for me, again, sort of one of the performances in the championships was Beth's bronze, simply because of the swim. That swim was a brutal swim.
Yeah.
The river flow was 4 kilometers an hour. Now, 4 kilometers an hour, most people couldn't swim at.
Would be going backwards,
couldn't swim
right?
at that pace at full sprint. And so therefore what they would be doing is actually going backwards. And you think about it's having done far too much open water swimming, and particularly river swimming, it's wonderful when you've got the flow going with you because you absolutely fly. When you come round, it is like being on a treadmill, because remember, there are very few cues when you're swimming. But the one cue that you've got, I mean, that water was pretty unsavoury, so you can't see the bottom. But what you can see the sides. Now, when you're going with the flow, the boats and the trees and the buildings are going like this, constantly coming past you. Once you're going against the flow, all of a sudden, that boat that you're looking at from your right-hand side simply doesn't look like it's moving. And so therefore the cues that you're getting in terms of your performance, in terms of your effort, are very, very different. So it takes a really mature swim to cope with that and actually have a positive swim. And I think for me, that's where Beth really shone. Is she had a great swim, came out in that front pack, and then evolved from there. So it was a great performance.
And what does it take for an athlete? We had her on the podcast and she was brilliant, but what does it take for an athlete who's tried for years to be at the top of their game at one particular event, one particular sport, and just hasn't been able to cut through, and yet has stuck with it to adapt and change and find something else that she can be great at?
Well, I think more interestingly in the sense on that is what we call the transfer. So when you move from one sport to another, incredibly difficult thing to do, because however you cut it, the bottom line is it takes an awfully long period of time to become an elite athlete, and yet what you're doing is you're going from that awfully long period of time trying to make it in a sport or making it in a sport. I mean, there's good examples Rebecca Romero is a great example of that, who won a silver medal in rowing and then talent transferred into track cycling and medaled in track cycling. Incredibly rare to do. We've now started to see a process, and in fact, we started this when I was at the English Institute of Sport, a process of talent transfer. And we often see it in things like sprint into things like bobsleigh and the sliding sports in winter sports. So you move from summer to winter. But actually, the idea that Beth goes from 10,000 meter running into triathlon, I mean, obviously it came at the right time for her. The triathlon was an Olympic sport. It wasn't prior to 2000. It came that there was a transfer of at least one of the events within that. But actually, the outstanding piece of that really is that she came in had to learn two brand new disciplines. And so therefore, to some extent, you're not starting from scratch because you've got the physiology and critically you've got the psychology, the mentality to be able to push yourself and push yourself hard. But nonetheless, she's having to condense that ability to learn those two new skills, those two new sports, and come out as Olympic bronze medalist at the end of that. I mean, it's a great story. It's a great story.
Another great story and another great athlete who came to her sport particularly late, comparably against other athletes, is, of course, Helen Glover, who's a mum of three and has, I think, been a bit of a trailblazer as far as mums at the Olympics are concerned, with the way in which she's sort of told her story and how she's come back. And she came back in Tokyo, but didn't make it to the podium. But she did this time with that silver medal. I know that she'll probably be disappointed in that they got pipped on the line by the Netherlands in their women's four. But how incredible a story as hers in how she's been able to showcase how women at this Olympic Games can still put in these extraordinary performances.
No, I mean, absolutely extraordinary. I mean, it's an interesting one. So I published a book called Bump It Up. It's about exercise and pregnancy. And I think what was interesting in writing that book about the critical importance of exercise during pregnancy and postnatal, the real importance of it is that I think to some extent it was interesting in the sort of research of that book to understand that we have a weird understanding of pregnancy, is that we almost treat it like a disease, is that a woman's got a disease when she's pregnant. And it's like, yeah, exactly. And yet since the dawn of man, women have become pregnant. And have survived what is an incredibly, challenging, physiological insult on the body, but also a psychological insult, and then the ramifications of having children post that and the changes that occur within the body, etc. But I think what's interesting is it's become, to some extent, we've started to highlight it. So we look at people like Serena Williams. When she came back as a mum, there was a big deal about her coming back onto the tennis court and actually hitting the ball again. And yet now what we've done is we've sort of highlighted the mothers that have returned. To some extent, there's no particular reason why physiologically they can't return. I think what's perhaps more interesting is actually the psychosocial aspect of returning as a mother. Is that now life has changed? You've got children. Your responsibilities, the demands on your time, and I think add on top of that is this layer of social expectation of what you should do as a mother. You should be at home looking after your children. What you're doing in a boat rowing. And I think all of those things play into what is quite a difficult environment for a woman to return to sport, particularly elite sport, because we are talking about a huge commitment of time and effort in order to actually return to elite sport. And so I think, for Helen, I think it's a wonderful story of what can be done. I think that's what's crucial, number one. I think number two is actually it's a wonderful story about tenacity and drive and determination. Is that she came back in Tokyo. I think they finished seventh, if I remember correctly. But she carried on. And she continued to fight. And believe, for anybody listening to this who's never done it before, in terms of sport, it's miserable. This is not, the two most miserable sports that you can do is rowing and swimming because you are fundamentally isolated. You've got nothing, no feedback. I mean, swimming, all you see is the black line. And with rowing, much of the work, particularly in the UK and in the winter time, is actually done on ergs. Those ergs don't go anywhere. You stare at a screen and a brick wall for hours and hours and hours, whilst at the same time pushing yourself to the absolute limit. I mean, they are miserable sports to be good at.
And we get a real
And so,
no, it's right, and we get a real sense of that when we listen to Adam Peaty talk about how the sport that he loves broke him emotionally and in every way, and it made him turn to things that he never thought he'd turn to in those moments, in those darker moments. And so for someone like that, silver for him absolutely represents a gold-winning performance, doesn't it? Given where he's come from and the challenges he's faced in recent years and where he's at now. And when you look at how close that finish was with 0.02 seconds dividing, first, second and third, or first and 2 seconds, it's kind of like, well, it could have been anyone's and he could have so easily won gold.
yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think, Adam's an interesting one because I think to some extent it's a very recent evolution, particularly for men, is to actually talk about mental health.
Yeah.
And I say particularly for men because I think that the social pressure to not admit to mental health issues for men has been overwhelming for a considerable period of time. And it is really only in recent time. I remember doing a challenge with Greg James for Comic Relief a few years ago. And it was really one of the first times that a high-profile individual had come out and said that they have had mental health issues. And I think that spawned a debate and allowed conversation to occur. And it is, elite sport is a very difficult environment to be in. I think what we see as the viewer is we only ever see the end product. What you do is you watch the Olympic Games, you see them in the final, and then you see them get up on the rostrum. And to some extent, it's easy to reflect on that and think, well, it's easy. You just rock up, put your trunks on, and swim up and down the length. What you don't see is the hours and the weeks and the months and the years of work. And for me, I'm not keen on the word sacrifice. Because I don't, it's not a sacrifice.
A choice.
Because it's what you love and what you do. It's very much a choice. And I don't like the continual word of sacrifice. But certainly what you are doing is that you adopt a different way of life. What you have to think with Adam, going back to swimming and the sort of misery of swim training is that 5 o'clock every morning, in the water 9-10 sessions a week, in the gym 3 to 4 sessions a week. I mean, it's large volume training. And because you're up so early, that means you can't go out at night. So that means that your friendship group and your social environment changes.
Shrinks.
So it's a very different way of life to live, and to do that for decades. And that's what it takes. It takes decades to get to that point. We probably can use the word sacrifice, but certainly that choice that you make will have ramifications. And for me, I think you're right. I mean, there were great examples at this Olympics so far. So Simone Biles is a really great example of overcoming mental health issues and coming back and being triumphant again. I think it shows a couple of things. One is it shows obviously the individual, the tenacity and the drive and the determination of the individual. But equally, what it does show you is actually the support structure that sits behind that. And that support structure runs from friends and family all the way through to the sports science support, so the psychology and the sports psychology support that these guys have got now. And I would dare to say that we see it in the modern era, but the reason why people often say to me, why have we got such longevity? I think one of the key things to that longevity is actually this support structure that now sits around athletes. It is the sports sciences, the physiology, the biomechanics, the psychology, the nutrition, the strength and conditioning, the sports medicine, all of that stuff, which enables an athlete to stay at the top of the game for longer, and so therefore gives them longevity.
Yeah, one of the amazing things that Adam Peaty said, which I loved, and I've written it down because I can't remember it, if you're willing to put yourself on the line, there's no such thing as a loss, which I think is a really poignant but a true expression of what it takes to be at that level for that length of time, for sure. Somebody else who's right in that mix is Tom Daley. Like 5 Olympics now and 5 medals at each of those games. I mean, his contribution to British sport, diving, is extraordinary. And he is one of those characters that transcends, I think, the sport that he does. But the other part of that story is the fact that he's in Los Angeles living his life with his family. Meanwhile, Noah Williams is back in the UK, and they're meeting up, intermittently at events to try and master this synchro program. And that's about it. I mean, I think they started their training in November, and they had sort of 2 solid months to try and get things right. It's like, I mean, not imagine what could have been possible if they'd had more time together, but it is extraordinary that they were able to perform to the level they were, to that standard, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, it is incredible because it is. We use this word team on a regular basis, but most people think of team as rugby and football. But here is a team of 2. And the thing, unlike rugby and football, is there's no hiding. All they've got on is a pair of budgie smugglers, and they're stood on the concrete platform 10 meters in the air, and that the performance is dissected, because it's filmed, it's slow mode, and it's absolutely dissected. So, I mean, for me, the synchro is incredible. And certainly when they nail it, when they deliver, it's incredible to watch. And of course, notwithstanding that, if you've never been on a 10-meter platform, just jumping off.
I was going to ask you that. Have you ever stood on a? Have you done that? Exactly. Have you done that? Because you're absolutely right. You sort of look at your ceiling heights in your sitting room and you think, and then it's another ceiling height and then another ceiling height to actually get to where they are where they are diving from or dancing effectively from. It's absolutely extraordinary, isn't it? What that takes. But for Tom, I mean, 5, like you say, we talked previously with Steve Redgrave and also referenced Ben. The idea of 5 medals at 5 games is astonishing, isn't it? To be at the top of your sport for that length of time.
I mean, absolutely. And again, it is that longevity which is truly remarkable, because it's the perfect storm, because it's not just about the physiology, and the physiology is something else. In elite sport, whatever the sport is, obviously the nature of that physiology changes depending on the sport itself. But it's also just the desire and the hunger and the drive and the determination to continue training. And I think I go back to this all the time, but I think it's the most important thing. The exciting piece and the cherry on the cake is the competition. The fact that they come back to compete is almost irrelevant, because that's the interesting bit. That's the enjoyable bit, the fun bit, is actually getting up on a snowy, rainy December morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, to go to the pool again. Having been there 100,000 times before, and knowing that as you drive to the session, you are going to have to beat yourself up again, for the 100,000th time. And for me, I think that longevity piece it's the psychology of being able to do that, which is truly remarkable, because it is, it's the easiest to some extent, and this is notwithstanding Andy Murray, but the easy thing is to say no, I'm done, and to retire. Particularly because you've won a gold medal, I'm done, thank you very much. But you keep going on. So what is the drive? Your entire career was driven around winning an Olympic gold medal. You win that Olympic gold medal, and then you carry on. It's astonishing. And I think that it's power to them. And I think, again, from the other side, to sort of reiterate this piece, is actually about staying healthy in order that you can sustain that type of training. And obviously what is changing with age is that physiologically you're changing. And it's interesting now that we're seeing, we would talk about old athletes, 20, 30 years ago, old athletes would be in their late 20s. Now we're talking about athletes being in their 30s and even into their late 30s. So what we've been able to do, and to some extent, I think the important thing here is to remember that the Homo sapien hasn't evolved in that time. We're not suddenly a different human over those 3 decades. We've got exactly the same traits, but what we've been able to do now is layer around the athlete the support staff that can actually keep them healthy. So sports medicine, which reduces illness when they do get sick, they can return and rehabilitate quicker. The physiology to ensure that they're training. What we do is make sure that the training is highly specific to them at that stage in their life with their capabilities. You then look at the nutrition in order to fuel that and to recover from that. So all of these things, and lots of people think, oh, sports science now. I did my degree in sports science in the late 80s, and 86 wasn't that late in the 80s, but started in 86. And at that time, I had to explain to people what sports science was. It was always caveat, oh, yeah, I'm doing a degree in sports science. Oh, that is X and Y. Now it's common parlance. We talk about sports science. Everybody understands what we're talking about. But think about that. It's a recent transformation. If you think about the British Olympic Medical Centre, where I was director of research at, that only opened its doors in 1986. So it's a really new evolution of sports science support that's come into the athletes. But it has made a huge difference. If we add on top of that coaching science, where now we have a much greater understanding in terms of coaching, of individualization, of training impulse, and that ability to understand effectively what we're doing with the athlete at the right time with that specific athlete. So the advancement of science and medicine of the past 4 decades, really has made a big difference in that longevity piece.
I just want to finish then on Simone Biles. You mentioned her earlier. And at the time of this recording, she's recorded 2 goals already, with several more opportunities to add to that tally in this games. And by the time we broadcast this, she'll probably have added more. I mean, what have you made of her comeback at these games? Because you feel like she was absolutely doing it for self as much as anything else, to prove to herself, not everybody else, that she could come back and she could overcome the demons that drove her to the issues she had in Tokyo. What's obviously, there's huge strength in character there, but also from a performance perspective, how spectacular a gymnast is she? What are we watching there?
Well, I mean, so she's been dubbed, and quite rightly so, the GOAT of gymnastics, the greatest of all time. I think it would be very difficult to argue that she isn't the greatest Olympian of all time. I mean, truly remarkable what she has achieved. Again, for me, I often look at a lot of these sports, and there are some sports we've spoken about diving, but gymnastics. I mean, what they do in gymnastics is utterly phenomenal, isn't it? And if you think of pick an Olympic sport where confidence is key, number 1 on that list would have to be gymnastics. Number 1 and 2 would be gymnastics and diving. But and for me, what she signifies really is this. Again, it's the longevity piece, but the true longevity piece. The performing. It's not about having been in the sport for a long period of time. She's been winning Olympic gold medals for a long period of time. It's that repetition. For me, it's the repetition which is the true mark of excellence, and I think she demonstrates that. And then, of course, midway through that process, she has these significant mental health issues, which then led to her withdrawal from the Tokyo Olympics. And at that point, nobody would criticize her for retiring at that point. Nobody, and yet she comes back. And I think what's really interesting for me at this Olympic Games is that we talk about various athletes being the face of the Olympics for their country. So the French swimmer who what an incredible performance that was. Yeah. 200 fly and 200 breast. I mean, a combo that you never hear of ever. but to win 2 Olympic gold medals in the same session. He had I think it was a 45-minute break between the 200 fly and the 200. If you've ever swum 200 fly, I've swum it a few times. You're doing nothing 45 minutes after you finish 200 fly. He comes out and wins 200 breast. But but he, he's the face of the Olympics for France. For me, I would dare to say that someone like Simone Biles is probably the face of the Olympic Games, and to perform at the Olympic Games under the level of expectation and scrutiny, I mean, real scrutiny that she's getting. The coverage in the US has been incredible on her. And it's the question of, can she do it? At the same time as the vast majority of people saying she has to do it, she will do it. And you can sort of think, well, perhaps she's impervious to that. I don't think anybody is impervious to that level of scrutiny. And yet she is able to cope with that and still deliver. And I think for me, she is, I would have thought, without any shadow of a doubt, is from the whole Olympics, has been the outstanding performer of these Olympic Games so far.
What I love about her as well is, and I've watched her documentary on Netflix too, is that she's got a great sense of humour. She's got really good perspective, and she's got a really good sense of humour, and she's got an incredibly complicated backstory too. So her perspective and her approach is mind-blowing, but it must come from a really strong place in terms of a strength of character that she clearly has. She's absolutely phenomenal. You're right. For me, she's also the face of these Olympics. But we're not done yet, Greg, because we've got another week or so to go.
I know. It's exciting, isn't it?
So yeah, I know. So what are we going to talk about next week?
Oh, there'll be something. There's no doubt about it. There's a lot. Hey, listen, a lot to come. So we've still got the swimming to come. We've still got track and field starts. And track and field always throws up some incredible stories.
Yep.
We've got a lot to come. Sailing still to come. A lot of rowing still. I mean, there's so much still to come. And from a Team GB perspective, we've got defending champions to see again, see how they get on. We've got new faces to the Olympics to see how they get on. And just as we're finishing, for me, one of the greatest races I saw was the women's double, who only qualified very late on at Luzerne at the last chance saloon. A debutante in the stroke C, and they come out and win a bronze medal. And I think sometimes we talk an awful lot and focus an awful lot on gold. I think
right.
Sometimes the bronze and this weird thing to say, but the bronze was their gold medal. Here was a crew that didn't know they were going to be here a month ago. And they come and they deliver on the biggest stage and win a medal. I mean, that, for me, that's what's fantastic about the Olympics is there are so many of those uplifting stories. It's not only about the golds; it's about everybody who's out there competing.
I do feel for the people that finish fourth, though. That must be truly, truly gutting.
I have this conversation with my kids on a regular basis. Right? So, I've medalled at World and European Championships, and equally, I've been fourth. And it's a weird thing that we've got this arbitrary cut-off line.
We do.
Where the top 3 get a medal. Now, interestingly enough, in the early 1900s, it was only the winner that got a medal. Nobody else got one, just the winner. And so, therefore, would we at that time have said, second place, worst place you can finish? And it's a weird one because we've got this arbitrary cut-off line. Fourth place, granted, you don't get a medal, but you are still fourth at the Olympic Games, the 4th best in the world. Now, that's not a bad place to be, is it?
No, 100% not. Greg, thank you so much. We'll catch up again, same time, same place next week.
I look forward to it. Exciting times to come.
Join us for the Performance People podcast every week for the highs, lows, lessons and stories from people like this lot. Michael Johnson.
Some days what I would see is a person who is a shell of what I used to be.
Eddie Hearn.
We don't operate in a business that's dangerous, but we just operate in one where you've got to sleep with one eye open.
Mo Farah.
It couldn't get any harder than what I've gone through, and at that point I just went for it.
Paula Radcliffe.
You can only control yourself.
Susie Wolf.
And Toto did once liken me to a donkey.
Every Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts.